I think solving this problem of connection is the number one problem that workplaces everywhere need to figure out. I always get a jaw drop from the audience when I say, literally 20 plus years ago, working in the US intelligence community with a top secret clearance, which by the way means I'm working in a SCIF, that's a secured compartmental infrastructure facility, where I have to go in to badge in to get to my computer on the high side. But I was able to structure Monday through Friday telework options where I'm still in the office daily, but I'm also able to take elements of my work home. Some of the best ways I've seen change adopted in large scale, highly matrixed, bureaucratic organizations like the US government or military is
Hello, workplace innovators of the world. Welcome back to Workplace Visionaries, the podcast that gets real about the present and future of how people work. I'm Jane Young from Hubstar, and this episode is a conversation with Mika Cross, a sought-after voice on the future of work and workplace policy, and a frequent expert witness for the US Senate. What I love about talking to Mika is the really unique perspective that she brings as a combination of workplace transformation strategist, federal human capital expert, US Army veteran, and mum. Mika was a finalist for Innovator of the Year in the US Forces and Business Awards. She's held roles in the US intelligence community, the Department of Labor, and fully remote private companies, always focusing on organizational health, flexibility, and a people-first approach, achieving incredible results like 100% employee engagement scores, even in large bureaucracies. In this episode, we talk about workplace change, generational differences, mental health and well-being, leadership in the face of complexity, purpose and meaning at work. And Mika always pulls it back to the importance of people being okay, and how can we create cultures that support people to do their best work. And more than that, live their best lives in a way that drives both well-being and performance on the basis that they go hand in hand. So if people first leadership is your jam, I'm sure you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Mika Cross, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jane.
Really glad to have you here because I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while, actually, because there's just something quite different about your background. You know, you're serving in the military, the intelligence community, as an expert witness in US Senate hearings, and all of that combined with your life experience. You know, I know that a big driving force for you and what you do and what you believe about work has been your role as a mum. So I think the combination of all that just gives you a really unique perspective on the human aspects of work and workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of used my life as a test bed of experiments for how workplaces do or do not welcome a variety of humans into the workplace. And are they accommodating a need for different preferences, different styles, different livelihoods, different life experiences, and how we can still get the best out of our talent while providing supportive workplace policies and strategies. And that's been a big passion for me, both personally, as you mentioned, navigating life as a military veteran when I transitioned out of active duty service, serving my country, also transitioning to single parenthood after a painful divorce, and navigating things like becoming an advocate for my youngest child when he wasn't quite diagnosed with a specific something, but we were trying to figure out how to place him in the right environment. And what might that look like when we welcome him to the workplace later on, or those that are like him, maybe neurotypical and those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I suppose every generation thinks that they're in unprecedented times. And I guess they're right, really. But at the same time, I'm actually a big fan of old futurism, you know, because I love reading what people back in the 40s or the 50s or the 70s thought was in store for humanity and work. And what I find really fascinating sometimes is how similar old futurism is to new futurism. as in we've known certain things for a very long time in terms of what makes great organizations, great leadership, how technology might impact humanity, what's good for humans psychologically, and all kinds of things. So if you step back and look at all the change and all those life experiences that you've gone through, and maybe even beyond that in history, and reflect on the current state, this big acceleration of remote work that's gone on, rising awareness of things like mental health issues and neurodiversity. What do you make of this time that we're in now? There's all these big AI risks, there's opportunities, like I say, the mental health crisis, the fixation on place in some ways as regards work. Do you think we're overhyping this pace of change and the idea that we're on this precipice of doom in many ways, or do you feel hopeful, or what do you think?
I kind of think D, all of the above.
Yeah.
I think we're also in this era where people are trying to find some stability in any environment that they're navigating, whether that's work, whether that's home, whether that's community. People are quite fractured. I think for the most part, we're not doing okay, especially on the heels of the global pandemic and all the uncertainty that came about with that and the rapid changes to our lives, how we worked, our families, our communities, and people are trying to slap things together the best way they know how. And often that defaults to things that are comfortable or were known. That's why I think we're seeing this push back to the way things were, whether that's back to the office or back to this sense of somewhat stability across our teams. But the truth is, we've seen, as you mentioned, this ebb and flow and this push and pull since the dawn of time, quite frankly, because we're dealing with human thoughts, minds, behaviors, hearts, feelings, experiences. And when we're talking about workplaces and teams that are embracing sometimes 5 generations of preferences, competencies, skills, expertise, and backgrounds, a one size fits all just does not and can never fit all when we're thinking about workplace strategy. So nothing about this really surprises me. I'm going to be honest. I anticipate this ebb and flow, this push and pull. But what does surprise me is the change readiness aspect. It's like after all that we've been through, when you're studying change doctrine, when you're looking at the experts, when you're reviewing history, you'd think that we'd have a better system of learning and then applying those systems to how we're going to embrace change, even if we don't quite know what that looks like. And also from a human-centered lens, how can we support the people that we are expecting to implement the change, adopt the change, and succeed in the change? And I don't think we're doing a fantastic job of doing that.
Why not? Why do you think we aren't? What is holding us back from doing a better job?
Well, businesses are always hyper-focused on the next big thing, profitability, 10xing it. Sometimes we forget to take pause and inventory of the things that we're already doing really well, and maybe thinking that a success metric could be sustaining and continuing just that until we get our grounding, until we get our footing. We're always aspiring for better, more. And sometimes I think to our detriment of really instilling the systems and supportive structures, policies, programs, and initiatives that can sustain long-term change and equip and enable people to have the wherewithal, the energy, the drive, that instrumental experience, that discretionary effort that we're all hoping to get so that people can actually drive the kind of change that we're hoping for. And when you forget to invest in those systems and the people that are doing it, we're burning them out. People are feeling fractured, misaligned. They're not quite understanding of all the priorities that you're putting on their plates. Which ones can I tackle first and are at the top of the list? Because if everything is met with the same level of urgency and importance, then then it's an email or it's a metric of badge swiping rather than really taking a look at the success metrics that drive performance, outcomes, and long-term sustainment of change.
Yeah, because it does feel like we've known forever that, well-being and autonomy and the psychological factors and all those things, we've understood in terms of research what it takes to have an excellent organization. But yet applying that, I mean, I guess there's possibly some leadership worldviews that just don't believe the research. But it's interesting what you say about that constant performance pressure driving us getting ahead of ourselves and then never really moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, because we saw that during COVID too. People were trying to replicate what they thought they were doing well or that was sustaining outcomes in a traditional office into these remote settings without investing in the skill for how to properly work effectively across distance from a remote location. Do we have the systems, the processes in place to strengthen the way that we work, rather than by default working by meetings and sort of slapping things together where I require your time on demand to get my work done? The best companies do take pause and strategically are making those proper investments in working more efficiently and effectively, first and foremost, in equipping leaders and managers, whether they're voluntold into those positions, whether after layoffs they're having to be put into, I call them accidental leadership positions, accidental managers, in this fractured kind of organization that we're navigating, or that's workplace that we're navigating. And they're actually investing in the right kinds of skills to lead people, to lead teams, and then to create more efficiencies across their workflows.
It does seem to be that as technology enables us to do more complex things, the cognitive load on employees is inevitably increasing. It's not like technology suddenly makes our life easier and we all just work these short weeks and have an easy time because technology is so great. I know that that's one possible idealistic path of AI, but generally work gets harder and more complex. And therefore, if we can do more, there's the bar. It gets higher and higher and higher and more, and the burnout. And it just does seem to be this, it seems at least like an increasing pressure to just do more and more with less and less. And maybe that drives a kind of frantic thing with certain leaders that puts all that pressure into the workforce, possibly an element of that.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is this resource collision. And often tech is the tool that people want to invest in the most because they think it's going to solve the problem automatically, quicker, faster, more rapidly. But sometimes we forget that the majority of the global workforce are not in knowledge management roles. In fact, they're in deskless positions, frontline workers, and may have a different set of competencies and skill to be able to quickly, rapidly adopt some of the technologies in AI that we're asking them to adopt. So how are we going to structure environments that inspire clarity, trust, the ability to fail safely, take risks, poke holes in things, and create a better outcome when we're talking about cultures of collaboration, innovation, and driving results for everybody, not just those that sit behind the desk, because we often are the ones that are the first adopters and we think through that lens of everybody is working the same way we are, but that's not the case.
God, there's so many things to pick at in everything you've said. Going down the change route for a minute then, you've obviously done a lot of work around workplace transformation and change strategy. And these days, I guess everything is just always in flux. It's just changes is constant. And there's change at all sorts of levels, isn't there? There's the level of an individual mourning the loss of their corner office. Then there's convincing managers who used to walk around the office to master all this asynchronous communication with a hybrid team. And then there's big change around things like portfolio right sizing and space design and hybrid policies and culture and well-being and meeting practices, tech adoption, like you say, guidelines around when being physically together matters the most. There's the generational expectations. It's just kind of endless. And for decades, I guess loads of studies have found that most, typically about 70% of change efforts fail. And I remember some Gartner data a few years ago now, but it showed that I think 80% of organizations still were managing change top down. So senior leaders make decisions, they create plans, detailed implementation roadmaps, and then they blast out communications to get buy-in. But the data showed that this approach was not only failing to drive this understanding and commitment they were hoping for, it was actually reducing understanding and creating anger and anxiety and resistance. And I guess the alternative is a more open source kind of approach where leaders would help employees co-create those decisions and open communication and dialogue and all that sort of thing. But I'd love to hear about it. It's easy to say those things. I'm not sure it's so easy to do them. So I'd love to hear a bit about your experience of workplace change and transformation and successful change, or unsuccessful change for that matter. Yeah. What that looks like on the ground, because everyone really wants to know what successful organizations are doing differently.
Yeah. Well, I think your point is absolutely spot on in terms of why some change, maybe many, change management initiatives, modernization initiatives end up not landing the way that executive leaders hope for. And I think that's because change isn't a waterfall. It doesn't need to only come from the top down. It needs to be at all layers of the organization. And it's a series of solvable frictions, really, if you think about it. So some of the best ways I've seen change adopted in large scale, highly matrixed, bureaucratic organizations like the US government or military is when leaders don't just sell the change themselves, but they allow people to sell it back to them. And so that might look like smaller test beds where you're also equipping managers, team leaders at the lowest levels to ask the right questions, like instituting maybe rituals of inviting teams to give their top 5 reasons why this change initiative will fail. Or maybe designing opportunities in terms of countermeasures to offset the reasons why people feel like it may fail. And also hearing from them in terms of how they understand the initiative, the priority, and the impact of what that change will result in. Often there's a misfire between the intent of a change strategy and how the people at the lowest levels are, and I don't mean lowest levels in terms of, hierarchy, just in all levels, let's say, are really understanding the impact and why it matters to their mission, their sense of purpose, their meaning of their job, and their importance of their time, energy, and outputs. So that friction audit is a really important way to kind of get at the crux of it. If you're able to also maybe map new workflows, figure out one friction point across the team and try to solve for that on a small scale, you're creating these test beds of innovation labs at all levels where people are creatively helping to solve the problems, but also teeing up to you at any level throughout the organization problem points where there could be places that need to be unstuck. I think also when you're thinking about like a regulatory implementation of change and like, we're going to do this, we're going to focus on compliance, those sorts of things. People feel fearful and scared of making mistakes, even when they don't understand it. So often that might look like in a all hands, a town hall, a strategy session. You might have your CEO, leader, executive making a statement to the workforce, and they're laying out all of their strategic priorities of this change initiative and saying things like, do we have any questions? And everyone's shaking their head, no questions. And the default is, oh, everyone understands. Yeah. Everyone's on the same page. That might not be the case. People might need some time to digest, to come back later with their questions and be able to have an environment where they're able to flag those potential reasons why change might fail or those friction points. So the organizations that I've seen do that best have an ecosystem of feedback channels across the organization, bottom up, top down, and from the left to the right flank, as we would say in the Army. And it is sometimes easier said than done, but really it can start by just teaching people how to ask better questions, how to create these cultures of curiosity, and how it's not just like, does anyone have any questions? What happens if we fail? What does it look like if we succeed? how can we learn from the mistakes that we're making? Because those organizations that do that really well in psychologically safe environments are the ones that outperform their competitors, hands down, time after time. And the research studies show that.
What do you think stops the development of a psychologically safe environment?
I think fear, for the most part. Sometimes when people get to a certain level, a certain title, a certain pay grade, whatever it may be, you don't want to think that there might be holes in your strategy, or you might have a false sense of self in terms of ego when it comes to the success rate of your initiative. Maybe you think it all falls on your shoulders, but collectively, how can we get anything done without the buy-in of others who are doing the work on the daily basis? And so organizations that really get that understanding and do it well create these cultures at the micro levels where people are incentivized and rewarded for taking risks, poking holes, asking questions with the intent of learning from mistakes so that we don't replicate them again.
It's kind of the opposite of this maybe more old school leadership veneer that, we've got all the answers as a leadership team. Here's what we're going to do. Everything's fine. Glossing over the bad bits.
And I think so leaders that I work with, especially during the pandemic, when we were trying to implement new ways of working and technology and solve new problems because they look different in a different environment, that did this well, really understood how to institutionalize this culture of continuous learning, but also created ways to have a failure share. Part of our team check-ins will include first starting with what didn't go so well this week, and how might we learn from that, and celebrating it and normalizing it. And I think the other piece is that sense of instrumental assistance, where you're creating teams that feel connected to one another, even if they're not physically co-located, so that when there's a problem and when there's an issue, you feel comfortable, Jane, letting me know you see a flaw in my research or a mistake in my report or something that's not calculating properly. And I'm not taking it so personal, because it's not that it will ding my performance. It's that we need to correct it and get it right to have better outcomes for our customers.
It's a good point. It's actually one of the things that I'm most proud of in my team is that, if in doubt, shove it all on a board and everybody rip things apart and add things on, and just, it's not personal. And it's what you create a vastly superior result if you can actually work that way. I guess the other thing about complexity is that, and you kind of mentioned this in different words, is that leaders can overestimate how much they know. I think it was Chekhov that once said, art doesn't have to solve problems. It only has to formulate them correctly, as in make us fully feel the problem without denying any part of it. And maybe that speaks to what's missing in some leadership right now in some organizations, because we're dealing with a very complex adaptive system, aren't we, that we can't totally control, and if we oversimplify what's going on and don't take the time to maybe align on the definition of the problem before leaping to solutions, chances are we aren't going to have that positive an impact. And there was some research actually in the Academy of Management Journal, I think, that spoke to this, and they found that a lot of change initiatives, they're not launched because they're strategically important, but purely to quell leaders' anxiety about performance challenges. And they called this defensive organizing. So they get freaked out about performance, they leap on an idea and they start executing, which actually makes things worse because it's not necessarily solving the problem, and everyone gets exhausted and skeptical. Exactly. And the INSEAD professor who ran that study, he said, you can't change the world if you're not willing to change your world. Leaders don't want to look in the mirror and face the limits of their control.
I agree with that. And I think also, one bit of advice to add to that is to assume differences until you've proven similarities, and then design for both.
Interesting.
Because we often look at the world, the workplace, those who we lead as just automatically defaulting to similar learning behaviors, work styles, preferences as ours. We forget sometimes to take pause and inventory of that. And we really do need to design for the differences, especially when we're talking about generational differences in the workplace as well. So both those themes are just so incredibly powerful when you're thinking about how do you apply that to future of work strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, the generational differences thing is, I guess it's getting a lot more airtime now because in some ways the generational cycles are maybe coming thicker and faster. You know, there's a great, Jean Twenge's research is really great on this, her book Generations. And she just looks at all these huge data sets on generational shifts, much of which is driven by technology, and argues that these shifts in dominant technologies like smartphones, social media being obvious ones more recently, they sort of reshape our childhood experiences and our social interactions and life milestones, leading to these distinct traits like increased individualism, like what she refers to as the slow life strategy. So where we hit life milestones like career, getting married, having kids, hit them later because everything's like drawn out. And I guess if you think about this slow life strategy, arguably young people entering the workforce could be less prepared than they were a generation or generations before, which you could assume means they need more mentoring, more learning and more support, which, albeit I'm a huge advocate of remote work, I assume it's one potential downside of the rise of remote working. Even when I think back to my experience of my first couple of jobs and sitting in the boardroom and sort of shadowing the CEO and all this around all these trips to different places and all that. And so do you think it's possible for remote first young people to get the same kind of experience that they would have if they were in the physical workplace with experienced colleagues soaking that all up? And if that is a challenge, how can we design for that?
I do think it's possible, and I've seen it work well. There's certainly a difference, and it also matters what kind of job functions you have and how that's structured too. But, we do often hear that these generational categorizations, like Gen Z needs too much feedback. They want immediate gratification. They want immediate response in terms of feedback for their performance when they even do like task level work. Or is it that maybe they have less institutional memory because they entered the workforce during this crisis era level of disruption? So like we spend years teaching people institutional and tacit knowledge, typically in a typical career path, like those that are more seasoned have the ability of even structured relationships that have developed over time, whether virtually or co-located in a physical office. This generation of worker did not have that luxury. So they're entering a workplace blind for the most part. And again, when we don't stop with intention to design our onboarding, our pre-boarding, and our integration experiences at the first 30, 60, 90, 180 days for expanding introductions and an understanding of how the workplace at large works, not just your individual team. Often people will onboard and they know their supervisor and the immediate people that they work with. It's that second, third, and fourth level of your network that is so incredibly powerful and that they don't have yet. We haven't stopped to figure out how to design for that, I feel like. So we need to figure out how we can promise more to this generation and get them ramped up and connected with one another and other people in the organization who they don't have the luxury of working with each and every day. And that's especially important for remote and hybrid workers who aren't together all the time in the same place. So I think it's not that we have 4 or 5 generations in the workplace. We have a variety of preferences, work styles, communication styles, competencies, and the ability to connect with one another. And that generation came in a very fractured time in our history. So designing around that, which I don't think we've done well, some are doing okay, but it's not just mentorship. It's the ongoing investment in what does a career look like here? How does your work matter and map into the purpose of our organization? Are your success metrics matching your individual work style preference? Are the rewards and incentives matching what you actually want, and hope and desire? And if not, how are we going to transfer your skills elsewhere? Because this is a highly skilled, highly educated generation of workers that we need. And I'm hearing in some organizations, some alarming conversations around like, we're not even hiring Gen Z at the moment. We're not going to invest in Gen Z. I've heard
Really?
that. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, well, have you stopped to ask what happens in 10 years? What happens when you hit retirement? How are you going to structure your organization for success and succession planning, especially in a talent market where yes, oversaturation of job seekers, but a shortage of critical skills that we need.
Yeah, it does. It does seem that the frantic nature of change kind of, it ends up exacerbating short-termism, doesn't it?
I think so, for sure.
Yeah. And I wanted to drill in a bit with the policy side of things as well, because I know you've designed and implemented all kinds of policies around flexible work, broader human capital initiatives. And right now, I think a lot of workplace leaders are still wrestling with their hybrid policies. You know, most companies have implemented some kind of policy, whether they're communicated well is maybe another matter. But then there's all the distracting and kind of misleading headlines around RTO. But summing up what I understand is the reality of the situation, see whether you agree, is that, you know, most large organizations are opting for structured hybrids. That's the most popular model. And 3 days a week is the most popular requirement. Well, smaller organizations, which is essentially where the growth is at, need to hire more and more people, diverse talent pools. They are typically more flexible with fewer or maybe no mandated days. But on a personal level, I mean, my concern is that we risk going backwards, you know, because remote work was obviously a really big deal long before the pandemic. Only now we've just shone this big spotlight on it, the eye of Sauron is upon us. Suddenly there's this risk that we just screw things down too tightly. So we actually reduce autonomy and therefore shrink talent pools, give certain groups of employees a raw deal, particularly caregivers, people with disabilities and what have you, or otherwise damage well-being, especially if punitive measures for non-compliance are involved. Meanwhile, in terms of, I guess, what I do in my job, you know, I think having data on attendance is very useful for modeling demand, for space, for designing good experiences. But we need to make sure that data is used wisely and not in a way that's detrimental. So what do you think about all of that? And what advice might you give to leaders who are trying to figure out what to do with their hybrid policies and what to do with attendance data?
Well, I think data is important, but when I ask many leaders what their attendance data tells them, sometimes it's deer in the headlights. Oh, well, we've got perfect dashboards. We have 98% compliance with our policy. But how does that relate to work? Because to me, attendance is just a shadow metric. It follows work, but it's not the work. So we need to create like this portfolio of maybe performance conditions. And that does need to be more flexible, in my opinion. I think where data comes in and is excellent is the kind that you collect and can help inform strategy, meaning how are people using their in-office time together for what elements of the work? Is it affecting speed, creativity, trust, clarity, outcomes, success measures for our clients, profitability for our shareholders? So what outcomes are these policies designed to affect? And that's what I wonder. Has there been a linkage there? And what are we measuring them? So maybe practical moves could look like thinking about or auditing an outcome first policy. So maybe thinking about at the team level and then across an organization, what the top 3 outcomes might look like, and optimizing either in-office time together or work done better in general. And then really creating policies that enhance a purpose-based presence. And we've heard people saying, you know, create moments that matter. They can't just be moments. In my opinion, we need to make mattering mission critical again. We need to make the time we invest in our work or commuting into an office or spending time together matter. We need to make it aligned with meaning, purpose, and outcomes. And if we don't do that, those policies really fail your workforce who are implementing those measures each and every day, because they are too structured, they are too rigid, and they're viewed as mandates, not, as our colleagues will say, magnets. They're not pulling me to want to come spend time with you, Jane. I'm actually reluctantly going in just to comply. So is there behavioral insight in addition to the badge data, or could we create ways to assess, monitor, measure the impact of that and how it's working out? And are we taking into account any of the feedback that we're getting from our workers as well? Because I think it's a combination of both. Strategy, flexible policy. So I really do, I don't hate structured hybrid. I think there's some merit to that, and it's working well for many large organizations. I also don't think that coffee badging is entirely bad if you're going in for a purpose, getting the work done together, and then able to take that deep work home where it might be best suited to be done elsewhere. So when you're offering a flexible model that allows you to achieve your compliance goals, your purpose-driven goals, and your outcomes when it comes to work, you're creating a test bed in an environment that sort of matches most people the way that they need to design their work day, their work week, and their moments that matter.
Yeah. It's a shame we've had these big headlines as well, because, even companies like Microsoft, they might be implementing 3 days a week. They're trying to force everyone back more days a week. But then actually beneath the surface, there's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more exceptions, a lot more gray areas than that would suggest. So even if a company's opted for a structured hybrid model with 3 days a week, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single employee must be in 3 days a week, does it?
No. And then again, are we taking into account our deskless workers, those people that are not able to work remotely? So do we have hyper flexible policies that allow people to structure their work schedules and their work time in different ways, because they can bring their best to the workplace and also sometimes meet the customers where they're at in better ways, richer ways, extended periods of time? They're able to design that. And I've seen that firsthand. I always get a jaw drop from the audience when I say literally 20 plus years ago, working in the U.S. intelligence community with a top secret clearance, which by the way means I'm working in a SCIF, that's a secured compartmental infrastructure facility, where I have to go in to badge in to get to my computer on the high side. But I was able to structure Monday through Friday telework options where I'm still in the office daily, but I'm also able to take elements of my work home. And as a single mother of very young kids at the time, it would have been a showstopper for my career had I not had the ability to do that. And luckily, I was able to help structure some of the policies to extend to the rest of the workforce. The challenge was in getting supervisors and managers to understand that it's okay to allow Jane to work in this capacity, but maybe Mika's job doesn't allow for that, and a different kind of flexibility might suit her better.
So how do you, in a larger organization, that's a very complex thing to try and deal with, or does it just come down to team level autonomy and there being a general understanding that our goal as an organization is to accommodate people so that they can do their best work? Like how does it pan out in reality?
Well, I think data is a key element of that too. So like looking at your retention data, your attrition data, your performance outcomes in terms of the talent that you have, and then designing a plan around that. So if you're having high levels of attrition in the most critical skills that you need for your organization to get the work done, then there's an issue there, and you need to figure out how to design a policy that matches that kind of workflow or enables people to choose and opt into a variety of different work styles. Then the next step is to train supervisors and managers to manage the work and outcomes and create environments where people don't feel like if I don't show up to the office on this specific day at this specific time, I'm going to lose out in terms of preference, or I'm not going to be thought of for a high level priority project because out of sight is out of mind. So it's both, I think. And that is tricky, and it takes time to invest because you have to teach those skills of how to lead differently than just butts and seats and who's physically in proximity to me for me to grab, reach out and touch, whether it's remote and I work with you and you're 3 levels away from me because I see you every day, or am I able to think across the team in terms of a skills inventory and be able to pick the right level of skill based on the person and the project too. It just takes a little rewiring of how we think about work and design those workplace policies and incentives, both for those who lead people and those who are individual contributors.
Yeah, because I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that the brain drain, as Mark Ma, I think, called it in one of his studies, if you screw the mandates down too tightly, the people who leave, it's not evenly distributed in terms of human capital. It's the people with the longest tenure, the most experience, and possibly the greatest contributors that tend to leave first.
Absolutely. Hands down. Those are the people, your top performers, the ones you want to stay in your organization, that have more options than anyone and can walk out the door. And that is an unintended consequence of being too strict with your mandates and not flexible enough with your work flexibilities. And again, it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. Communication as part of the change management process is equally important.
Yeah, I think it was, is it Price's Law? Not the 80-20 Pareto thing, but the other one is the square root of the number of people involved in a creative endeavor produce half of the work, which is a rather scary thing if you think about that brain drain, because, it's fine if you've got 10 people. If you've got 10,000 people, there's a tiny number of people contributing the most of the work. If that plays out, which statistically it seems to. So yeah, it's still baffling that we take those risks in some ways. It's
I agree.
It's a worry.
It's a worry.
Yeah. So how do you think the conversation needs to move on in a way? Because we've got all this RTO debates kind of going on and dragging. I think everybody, there's always people whose worldview says that, this is a lot of nonsense, all the research, a lot of nonsense. We should just all be together or nothing. And then there's the opposite extreme of, complete flexibility and autonomy and a more idealistic view of the world. How do you think we can, what do you think really matters now in terms of the workplace and what we do next?
Okay. I think solving this problem of connection is the number one problem that workplaces everywhere need to figure out. People, again, they're fractured, they're traumatized in some ways, and they're feeling more disconnected than ever due to layoffs, restructuring, the rapid acceleration of AI, tech adoption, again, doing more with less, and watching their organizations and peers fall off their teams, especially in this last year. So how can you create cultures that can adopt and catch up with the speed of change, but not forgetting about the human layer of it and showing up for one another, especially when teams are changing and have that volatility so quickly and rapidly? The connection piece leads into everything: burnout, workplace stress, quiet cracking, quiet quitting, all of these negative outcomes in workplaces that globally employers of all sizes, all industries and occupations are struggling with. How do we reinvest in the people side? And I believe it's the connection piece. How do you create and solve a workplace that can show up for one another, lean in for one another? When you're sick, I'm going to take on the workload. I'm going to be able to do it well because there are processes and structures there, and we have designed a team processes, norms, and agreements, and we have practiced them so that no matter where, when, or how, we're able to still deliver exceptional results.
It really is an investment, particularly of time, isn't it? And effort in developing those systems. Instead of having our fiefdoms and individual contributors sort of sitting in their silos. And like you say, if somebody's off sick, nobody knows what's going on. Designing that cadence of work and having that information readily available, and having people being able to step in for each other. The other thing as well is what we were saying earlier about this sort of pressure that comes, and that's always wanting to do more and more and more. That doesn't leave a lot of room for having time to connect. Because I think in some ways, when you figure out the cadence of communication with your team, some of it can be, okay, a quick stand up. What did we do last week? What do we do next week? What are we focusing on? That kind of thing. And some of it can be we're doing the work live on whether it's virtual or whatever. But there's also a bit of room for just shooting the breeze with you and seeing what's going on with people. And sometimes we don't take the time for that, maybe.
I think so too. And I've seen it done with really great intent, but poorly executed. So, this mandatory fun, this mandatory together.
Oh no, how infantilizing.
Again, not designing for both those who are similar and want that and those who don't. And so where I've seen teams really thrive, and I worked with some of the highest levels of government leaders, like the chief demographer of the United States, the US Census Bureau during the global pandemic, with data scientists, ethnographers, demographers, math stats, highly introverted workers, highly skilled workers that were then forced into remote environments. Where the sweet spot was offering pockets of time and optional ways to connect in short sprints. And it took an investment. It took an investment in learning the words to say in a variety of communication mediums, platforms, delivery. So written, video, live, synchronous, asynchronous, and scheduling optional events for bringing people together in a number of ways that took into account time zones, different days of the week, replicating the same opportunity 3 times so people could opt in, and recording it for those who didn't want to be there live, allowing people, when we came together as a leadership team, to ask questions in the chat, come off mic, or if you don't feel comfortable doing it in front of other people, you can text in your questions. They are completely anonymous, and we will even show you and read from there. And if we can't answer those questions, we'll come back and answer them again. And so working with leadership teams to help instill this culture of trust, connection, and culture in the most meaningful ways. It took time. It took testing and iterating. And what worked 6 months ago didn't work 6 months from now. So it's keeping that open mindset and meeting people where they're at. That created the most amazing outcomes. I'm developing a case study now, but I'm talking about ratings of employee engagement upwards of 100% in some areas.
Wow.
I've never seen scores like it ever in terms of trust and transparency, understanding of communications, understanding of alignment of where the mission is going and how it's changing. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and that feedback loop where people felt like they could really say the hard things and ask the hard questions. It was a beautiful ecosystem of change, exceptional leadership, and trust in creating a culture where everybody felt they could have a voice. And even if we couldn't implement or answer or respond to all the ideas and suggestions, they felt heard.
Wow. I'm really curious to dig into more about how you made that happen, because theoretically, I get how all those components are important, but what does that consist of on the ground? Is it like workshops, and is it packs of information? Is it what is it? How did you do that?
I think first, to be honest, it was a leadership team that hired an expert and trusted them and trusted the expert, meaning let me get out of the way. And every idea was met with, that's a great idea. Let's try it. Some were met with, can I say that? Are those the right words to use? And I would say, yes, use the word togetherness. Use the word connected. I'm talking about, eras in our history that were spilling over into the workforce during the pandemic, really hard and challenging things to address. But there were functions of that mission that were internationally focused. And so where things were happening in Ukraine or Afghanistan, pretending and ignoring it and not addressing it was the wrong thing to do. We didn't always have the right 100% solution. What we did have was a leadership team that was curious enough, open, and trusting to try to say something, to try to meet the moment. And the feedback from workers, again, at the highest levels of government doing such important work, were, thank you so much. And, of course, I was there as the conductor, but I wasn't there as the talent. It was their show. And so it was a combination of coaching, consulting with the executive leadership team, looking at data measures, hearing feedback from the workers, customizing and designing strategic communications, both internal and external, but at all levels, not just the executives, also where the executives would say, and Jane, I want you to take that back to your division and make sure that you integrate these talking points into your next town hall too. So it was a trickle down effect, because if we didn't say that, then the responsibility only becomes the executive leader. But we needed everybody to be a conduit of the way we wanted to treat each other and create those cultures. And it worked.
Wow, I love that. You've got such great experience around everything to do with connection and well-being. I think often we look at wellness rooms or gym membership, and I'm not saying any of that's bad, but it feels like the sticking plaster, particularly if your culture is such that you make people feel, not on purpose, obviously, that they've lost agency or autonomy, or that you overburden them with workload, or that you say the right things about openness and such like, but you maybe your everyday language or your actions communicate a different reality. So people have this cognitive dissonance. I think that's quite a common thing as well. I mean, meanwhile, like you say, burnout is rife, mental health is tanking. You see these charts. The kind of 2012 when smartphones and social media became ubiquitous, boom, mental health tanking. Not saying it's as simple as that. So these ways of moving beyond the sticking plasters and the platitudes to have that real impact are very fascinating. And what role do you think place has in that connection building?
I think you can create place from anywhere. And I think you can create connection from anywhere. So when things started opening back up, I was working with executive teams to offer on-site opportunities to come together in person, co-located, while also offering virtual opportunities. And people had the option to opt into however they wanted to engage. And that was the most meaningful way, because they didn't feel excluded. And let's just face it, Jane, exclusion, whether intentional or not, it activates pain receptors in the brain.
Yeah, because people don't fear change. They fear change that excludes them.
When people feel excluded, I think that's the most toxic thing you can do. And again, it may not be your intention. But when you're saying, I expect everyone to be in the office on Wednesday at noon, and my son has a critical surgery that day, and even though I'm protected through my employment rights and can take sick leave, how do I feel when I cannot show up there? I cannot show up there. It's not that I don't want to, I cannot. And so are we creating ways and systems to catch people back up? Are we recording those meetings? Are we sharing meeting notes so that when life inevitably happens, people are not feeling excluded? They are included, in that culture of inclusion. And I don't mean it from a DEI perspective, although we won't go down that bunny hole. What I will say is that people want to feel like their work matters, that they have a sense of purpose, and that they are a part of the team. They invest 1/3 or more of their lives at work. How dare we take that away from them when they want to come and do good work for us?
Yeah. That's so true. And I guess we can also exclude people with a maybe slightly old-fashioned need-to-know thing. Well, I'm at this level, so this is my business, and you just get on with the work that I tell you to do. And then maybe not necessarily on purpose, but it just kind of pans out that way.
Yeah. When I was a young officer, so I was a enlisted soldier, and then I was selected to become a commissioned officer. So that's a leader in the U.S. Army. So I've seen both. As a follower, I learned, and then I became a commissioned officer. When I was a very young junior officer, our 06 colonels and above would bring their junior officers to these very high level meetings. Now they told me,
wow,
sit on the wall, don't say a word, ask no questions, but if I look at you and invite you to say something, you can. However, what that did, it was a learning environment. You can replicate that in your virtual meetings, in your remote meetings too. Imagine if it was an incentive where you are allowing junior level employees to shadow some of the work you do, just so they can see what are the behaviors, what are the norms at the executive leadership levels in our organization? How do we treat one another? What goes on behind the walls? Can I be a fly on the wall and learn both the institutional and tacit norms that make this workplace special? and shine. And so I think those kinds of small, again, I'm hyper focused on the human layer of work. That's my superpower and skill that I bring to any employer. But we can do these things with a heart-centered approach that reaps incredible results.
I love that. You actually just made me think about something in my own life that is possibly more significant than I've given it credit for, which is that I'm from Shetland, which is a tiny little rock sticking out of the North Sea, halfway between Scotland and Norway. It's very Viking. But there was this one, I worked at the Shetland Times. That was my first job. But then I got this job at this really strange software company that had offices in Shetland, London, Texas, selling software to oil companies. But one of the things about that is I was 21 years old and I was hired to do anything I wanted by this very progressive founder who dropped out of Oxford in the 60s and was a computer programmer and who is to this day my second dad. But he had me as I had to do anything I wanted as 21 years old. I didn't know anything about anything, didn't know anything about business. It's the first time I'd even thought about technology, let alone SaaS and enterprise software. But I was in on every single board meeting in that company. So I was pretty much his assistant sidekick at first. And I sat on every single meeting. I sat in every single boardroom. I sat on these charts where we were drawing out the structure of how things flowed in the company. And I was like, wow. And this just completely opened my eyes to another world. I mean, I was in Shetland, which is culturally, I cannot even describe to you how much of a magic little bubble this was in that, to the point that I remember he gave me a laptop, a big chunky thing at that time. I'd walk across the road with it and passing traffic would wind the windows down and go, ooh, because I had a laptop and, it's like I say, it's a bit like Vikings or something. I don't know. It's not the place where you'd be thinking about business and technology and and so that experience of being in on the most senior meetings, knowing nothing and absorbing that and what that opened my mind to, together with his progressive style, possibly ahead of his time. And it really maybe set this whole scene for my obsession with autonomy and with the human aspects of work. And it feels very intuitive to me that the way that we often leadership norms are just not conducive to good outcomes for human beings.
Right. Again, it's like how our work is structured and those bureaucratic systems that we grew up watching our parents go get up, get dressed and go to work. So that's what work is. Or how we structure our time, even in an office where the executive leaders are behind closed doors all the time. That does not breed togetherness and collaboration. No. Let's just keep it real, execs.
Keep it real, exactly.
How are we opening our environments for learning, growing, career pathing, making mistakes, taking risks? And that requires a little bit of vulnerability. It requires transparency and investment, but also role modeling, walking the walk and talking the talk. And it's a hard skill sometimes to learn when you have been taught that this way is the way that leaders, executives, CEOs run their companies, corporations, and businesses. Those that get it right, though, are seeing the dividends, the impact, the productivity, the profitability, and the results in terms of delighting their customers. Yeah.
And that's another thing that the world has known for a very long time, but we sometimes don't pay attention to, is that how people feel at work has a huge bearing on how they create things and interact with customers, and therefore on the bottom line. I mean, we've seen that over and over, but it's still quite difficult in some ways to walk the walk. And in some ways, we need to take our work seriously, but maybe take ourselves a little less seriously. In terms of the psychological safety aspect, I think that's important. Because when I think back to that formative experience at that crazy company, I mean, there was huge arguments and that was fine. There would be a huge argument and then you walk in the next day and, it's not a big deal, because it was that great creative conflict that you would have, and also just having a good laugh. And when you think about the purpose and meaning of work, and I guess we could debate how how much work should be the thing that gives us purpose and meaning. But none of us want the bullshit jobs. There's now books called that, isn't there? Because Bullshit Jobs is that book. But yeah, I'm interested in your take on purpose and meaning at work, because maybe newer generations are looking at work differently. Like you say, they've seen their parents grow up doing certain things they don't necessarily want to follow in their footsteps in some ways. The career paths don't feel as secure as they did. The transience of jobs. And then what gives humans meaning? One way to look at it is voluntary responsibility. We take responsibility for ourselves, maybe for pets, maybe for families and children, maybe for teams and more people in the countries, and the more responsibility we can voluntarily bear, pick up the rock and carry it up the hill. That's one possible thing. But I guess it's not the same for everyone either. So what do you think about the reality of creating more meaningful work? I don't think it's just us saying, we're making this big vision statement, and then this is why it matters, and nobody buys that really. They do. For me, I think, sorry, I'm going into 50 questions all in a big word salad, but for me, I think doing difficult things with really smart people is a great source of meaning. Even if you were making cement in itself wouldn't be exciting. But if you're trying to do, as an organization, do something really difficult, really well with a bunch of smart people, then that seems to be a meaningful thing, because when you think about the people that you admire, it doesn't matter if they're musicians or sports people or business people, they tend to be people who are doing difficult things well, and they tend to be part of a team, because you can't typically do super difficult things all by yourself. So blah, what do you think about that?
Oh my gosh, I'm loving all of this. So one of the ways that I work in organizations to develop very customized learning experiences, but also engagement strategies, is to leverage assessments. And they may look different, but I really firmly believe in all the work that I've done that you need to understand from an individual perspective, the I in teams, the we in teams, and then our connected future. And so all our learning and development, all of the coaching and consulting that I do is around that. And I think workplaces who don't leverage assessments, and I'm not talking about personality assessments or skills assessments, I'm talking about even leveraging tools like the DISC assessment, MBTI sometimes, Clifton Strengths. What an amazing world that would be when at the start of your recruitment process, you would give the gift of understanding how to play to my strengths as an early careerist, mid-level professional, seasoned executive coming into an organization, and sharing that information across a team. So I know what motivates you, Jane, and how it's different from what motivates me, how I prefer to communicate and collaborate. That data is so rich in terms of how we process information, inspire motivation, align with purpose. Because even when we're doing work like churning cement, making butter, I don't love to cook, in the kitchen, whatever it may be, we can understand how to apply those tasks to playing to our strengths. And when that connection exists, there is a greater sense of purpose, meaning, satisfaction, which does drive better results. I think it's also important for us to then teach skill and prioritization, how to align skill, passion, purpose with task, performance-based outcomes, and what teams are responsible for in terms of outcomes. So shifting from place to purpose is going to be key in 2026 and beyond.
Yeah. And do you think that if you take those assessments periodically, the results change quite a lot over the course of time and your life, or do they remain fairly common?
I think they could. It probably depends on the assessment. So, I have a few, I won't say which ones are my favorite, but I integrate those into our L&D and training programs as well. Because I think it's really important to design around people's style of communication, collaboration, even energy levels, preferences, and styles. If we don't, we're throwing spaghetti on the wall. When you're bringing in keynote speakers, when you're bringing in training, you're thinking you're solving for a problem, and it's probably landing for 5% of your workers. Again, going back to building healthy, thriving workplaces that really focus on organizational health and performance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I suppose as well that the process of doing that and that being normalized within teams is that people become aware of differences. And I think even with with any relationship, I guess, being able to cope with others being different from you is really quite hard. I remember my mom saying that when I was a kid. She said, you can't make people think the way you think if you're having a conflict with someone. You can't make them see it through your eyes and make them feel what you feel because you're different. And it's a lesson that just never gets completely learned, even as grown-ups. We sort of try and, we don't always really feel okay with different points of view in a way that we should maybe be more tolerant of.
Well, and how powerful is it when you understand motivation and you can align that with work that has to get done? Because then it becomes an operating system and it's really designed for successful outcomes.
Yeah.
So you were also mentioning fun and laughter and doing, like, we can do serious things without taking ourselves too serious.
Yeah.
And so part of that culture change that's so necessary is also creating an understanding of the science behind fun, humor, laughter, and those relationships and connections across teams. And it's something that I'm super passionate about. We even bring in leadership lessons from Ted Lasso. But it's like teaching these very serious people. Like, I worked with the Army Futures Command last year at their executive town hall, and they are laughing and then looking at each other like, are we allowed?
Are we okay to laugh?
Permissible. But what I invite leaders to think about is, how can we humanize the workplace to really inspire those results that we're trying to get to? It can't just be through technology and skills-based training. It has to be around how we breed togetherness, and it doesn't have to be in a co-located space.
Yeah. And because there's, I guess, the antithesis of not taking yourself too seriously is this idea of, I'm a leader and I must have gravitas, and therefore, I'm serious and I have to come across it. That whole thing. Will we ever get rid of that?
That's a people thing. I think
it's a personality thing. Do you think?
Yeah, it's a human personality thing. So I think it depends. And that's part of what I've seen over many decades of expertise, especially with workplace flexibility, is like, people like their big offices. They like their parking spaces. They like their names and titles etched on the outside wall. They like their assistant to be out there to kind of screen people who have access to them. Like, are we going to get over that kind of hubris? I'm not quite sure. Can we evolve and grow to understand that better outcomes and better results are when we are able to focus on the people piece of work as well? I think I like to think so.
Yeah, I would like to think so too. And some of it's just being in the moment and not being too afraid of messing up, isn't it? Because there's a beautiful book called a swim in a pond in the rain, which is by a guy called George Saunders, who teaches writing. It's a book about writing, but he said, with a plan, we stop thinking. And what that was about was, our anxiety makes us crave method, when the situation can sometimes really demand just more moment-to-moment responsiveness to what's actually happening in front of our face. I think the example he used was someone nervously taking cue cards to a first date. And in some ways, do you think that's becoming worse? This kind of this self-consciousness about saying the wrong thing or putting your foot in it, or the things that would maybe take away from being in the moment when we're having interactions at work. Does it feel like it's getting better or worse?
I think it gets worse with the volatility of change and how quickly it's happening, especially when it comes to lack of transparency and uncertainty. So in environments like that, it does get worse. People are less inclined to speak up. They're not willing to raise their hand and ask the hard questions. They don't want to call attention to themselves or anything that could potentially look negative when they're watching layoffs happening, restructuring going on, and change at such high rates of speed. So that is a red flag to watch if you're an executive and a leader in a workplace in 2026, because you have to be able to figure out how to do both. How do we implement the changes that we want while not creating a scarcity kind of environment where people feel risk averse? And that is the antithesis of innovation, creativity, and solving problems.
Yeah, and I guess if there's increasing volatility, it's a natural human instinct to sort of retrench, whereas the opposite is what's required. And the ones who do the opposite of that and do innovate are the ones that typically would end up ahead. I mean, I guess the organic evolution and all of human history tend towards greater complexity. New technologies spring up, they encourage all these new and rich forms of interaction. Then social structures evolve that realize that potential. I was reading recently Non-Zero by Robert Wright that gets into this, and he says that we're approaching a culmination of sorts, where our species seems to face a kind of test towards which the basic forces of history have been moving for millennia. And he says that this is a test of political imagination, our ability to accept basic necessary changes in structures of governance, also maybe a test of moral imagination, because I guess various bleak outcomes are possible in terms of AI destroying us all and inequality and freedom and privacy and all these big things that are sort of talked about at the minute. I guess the question is, how can we influence a positive outcome? Is that something you think about or could offer individuals like me advice on? Because on one hand, as an individual, we could see ourselves as quite helpless to affect some of the societal issues that we're facing at the moment on this precipice, whether that's imaginary or not. And on the other, all change kind of happens on an individual level en masse. And, we all have our sphere of influence, whatever scale it's at.
I agree with that. And I think, feeling a little bit empowered in terms of your own personal accountability and showing up and how you show up is incredibly powerful. And so leading from where you're at, whether you're a new early careerist or an individual contributor, an aspiring leader or executive or current executive, we all have a part to play. And, negativity spreads faster than positivity does.
Yeah, we're wired for it, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. So even finding ways to check in for yourself first, like, am I feeling depleted? How are my energy levels? If I am, what are a few small things that could help restore or fill my cup so that I can better show up for myself first and then others in my life that I care most about, maybe my children, my friends, my neighbors, my spouse, my partner, and also the people that I work with, because we do spend so much time at work. And then what are those indicators when your batteries are feeling low, when your energy levels are depleted, and how you can restore them? Are there ways that you can catch it before it starts becoming systemic and languishing and potentially evolving into burnout, which the World Health Organization defines as long-term unmanaged stress? The challenge is that often we think about and we hear people talking about workplace stress, anxiety, burnout as sort of an individual responsibility. And there is a component of that, but I also believe that we need to teach teams how to lean in and check on each other. Again, ask those better questions, build and establish those relationships and connections so that it becomes a responsibility of everybody to safeguard boundaries, understand how to prioritize workflow, and ensure that we're removing friction. Because to your point, AI coming into our workplace, it's not just going to replace some human work. It's also going to replace and replicate bad habits. So we have a responsibility in terms of how we show up, how we check our own energy levels, how we, contribute or not to negative energy in the workplace. And that spreads like wildfire.
Yeah. Have you seen any examples in your work of combating that effectively? What have you seen on the ground?
I have. I actually work with a wonderful Army research laboratory since post-pandemic, and we designed some programming together with them called Wellbeing for Resilient Workers. It has been a multi-year project, and the topics are designed around what is affecting the workplace right here and now, and what are they struggling with? What do they want to talk about? What is of interest? So globally, we were hearing about all these reports of those big drones that were all around the world and unexplained. The FAA couldn't explain it here in America, the FBI. And this particular workforce was walking into work and out, and the big drones were in their communities, above their homes, above their workplace, and no one is explaining it. The level of stress around what that is or is not was exorbitant. And we created circles of conversation where people could express their emotions, maybe not outright. Sometimes it depends on the topic. People are willing to share or not in public forum, but also giving tools, tactics, and resources in terms of where people could go. How do we normalize talking about things like grief in the workplace, especially on the heels of COVID, where some people lost coworkers, family members, community members, and you're bringing that to work. What are the words that we say to one another? Because we want to say something, and often that awkward zone doesn't require you, but kind of forces you to not say anything if we don't know the right things to say. So again, those skills of human connection, I am seeing play out in so many important ways. We just did one on holiday harmony and the impact of mental mindful breaks, breath work, and resilience, especially on the heels of the United States' longest government shutdown. This workforce just experienced 40 plus days with no pay. Some of their team members were required to come to work every day with no pay. Many federal workers were experiencing 80% more workplace stress and anxiety, and it's going to take between 2 weeks and several months to dig out of the backlog and impact of what that looked like. Imagine the stress during a holiday season when you're trying to buy gifts or think about family members coming, or maybe navigating grief and loss in your own life. And so these things, as related to how the workforce performs, their productivity, their ability to get work done, is actually being invested in through these community conversations virtually.
Sounds like so much is just down to having conversations, but having the right conversations and finding the words and finding the ongoing ways to support each other and to listen.
Yes. And, part of their organizational health and well-being program does include things like the gym or maybe access to the Calm app or something like that. But more importantly, they're designed around what people need and want, and what are they experiencing at work. So often we come in and show them through the data how these topics, maybe it's the struggle of caregiving and parenting while working, again, navigating grief, financial fitness and wellness as part of this series. But what does the data say about performing better? And how can we give them actionable tiny steps and micro moments that they can implement both as individuals and across teams and organizations? And it has made such a big impact and difference for that workforce.
Yeah, because I guess the performance at work thing is a marathon, it's not a sprint, isn't it? So, sometimes we get so performance panicked in the moment that we don't take the time to deal with these life things that happen to every human being at times, and then in the long term, like so many things, in the long term, it bites us.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah. So what do you hope to be focusing on next, and the big problems you want to tackle? And because obviously you've been through so much, so many different experiences of relating to the situations of the pandemic, and it's just such a diverse background. And then a lot of this has been normalized in terms of learnings that you've taken from that. It sounds like you've taken a lot from that whole period of time and been able to really figure out a lot. What's next in terms of the things that you want to tackle and focus on?
Yeah, I think in the coming year, by the way, I want to mention, I work with some of the world's greatest experts, thought leaders, authors, trainers, facilitators. So I love partnering with people way smarter than me to solve some of the toughest workplace challenges. And so what I hope we will continue focusing on is helping to repair fractured teams, helping to reestablish realignment in moments where workplaces have undergone exorbitant change, again, layoffs, restructuring, reorganizations, hyper-focused on efficiencies. So we're taking that human performance and sort of readiness for change, but also things like AI adoption, specifically for non-technical workers, non-technical leaders, and frontline workers in this moment, and repairing that human layer of work, helping to create skill, leveraging data, and making sure that we're making meaningful impact so that people can focus on the work, but also have what they need in terms of tools and resources to show up for one another, to be able to have that sense of personal accountability when it comes to work, engagement, inspiration, purpose, and that teams are driving exceptional results for the bottom line as well.
And what advice would you offer to someone who's maybe like us, naturally inclined towards really getting into the people side of things and trying to understand human behavior and nature and what makes people thrive? What advice would you give to somebody in that situation who's facing leaders that maybe aren't that way inclined and maybe don't see things that way, and maybe they're working within constraints? What would you say to them?
I would say to start small and think about, could you map friction points, even at the team level, and see how you might be able to solve for things. Some moments in my career, I had to deal with literally zero budget and zero resources, and sometimes zero buy-in, but we were still able to effectuate change on a small scale. So sometimes when we think about these large, future of work initiatives, policy changes, change management initiatives, they seem so macro and large in nature and out of our pay grade or out of our sphere of influence. But even just bringing it down to what things you could be doing differently. Again, friction mapping, resource mapping is important. Maybe bringing in some assessments, and there are free tools out there. Start with yourself in the new year. And maybe even thinking about intention setting instead of goal setting and bringing that into your organization or team in terms of, what do we want to feel when we show up to work? How do we want to accomplish work to get done? How can we agree to collaborate and work together in a better way in the coming year? Even just at the small micro level, tiny small steps make a difference.
Well, I think that's a really great point to end on today. I really enjoyed our conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure, Mika. Thank you so much. Where can people go to see more of your work and your thinking?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jane. This was really delightful. Certainly LinkedIn is a wonderful place to start. You can just find me there. I think my profile is a work-life champion of the universe.
So it should be. I'd expect nothing less.
You can look for me there. Also on my website, mikacross.com. And my company page, which is strategy@work.us, like us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mika, for everything you do to make the world a better workplace. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight.